You're listening to the BBC World Service. Scarlet Women. In Omnibus this week, Shen Liknaitzky talks to veterans of the communist movement in Britain about their life and times in the party.
It offered me everything. It offered me friends. Most of my friends were in the party. It offered me something that I believed could change the world.
Frida Brewster became a communist in the 1920s. She stayed with the party until its eventual demise 70 years later. She was born in America. Her parents were poor Croatian immigrants. She was 6 years old when news of the Russian Revolution reached her family in Pittsburgh.
I came home from school, and my mother, who was a rather reserved woman, lifted me, picked me up, said, "Frida, the Russian people, the Russian workers have taken things into their own hands. People like us." And she went on, and she had tears in her eyes. And I thought, oh, that must be wonderful. I don't know what it means, but if my mum's happy, then I'm happy too. Let me tell you this, it was hope.
At the same time, halfway across the world, 15-year-old Rose Kerrigan was growing up in a socialist family in Scotland.
We were so hard up, and we lived in a room and kitchen, and I did nearly all the shopping because my mother wasn't very strong, you see. She must have been having babies and she had bronchitis. So I didn't understand. I was too young to understand these things. And you lived round the corner from the Royal Theatre. You saw people coming with tiaras in their hair and beautiful dresses to the opera and to the theatre at night. And you contrast, how were these people able to do all that and you're struggling here? So I questioned it from the very beginning, and so it wasn't hard for me to become a socialist.
Others, like Patience Edney, came from a more privileged background. But when she began working in an inner London hospital, long before the days of the National Health Service, she saw the effects of poverty at first hand.
People were much poorer then. When they did get to hospital to us, they were mostly too bad. They were hopelessly too far gone with whatever diseases they had. And of course they were then terrified. And they used to tell us, particularly at night, what's going to happen to my children when I die? They couldn't manage. Life was absolutely terrible. I've never forgotten those women telling us these things as though we'd understand. They thought nurses would understand. Well, we did. We listened to what they said. But it was never mentioned in hospital. It made us mad. They never mentioned poverty was one of the causes of illness, or unemployment.
But for Patience, it was not so much the Russian Revolution, but the events in Spain, almost 20 years later, that prompted her to take a place in the front line of politics.
There was so much wrong, such a lot of horribleness, and no way that I knew of that you could deal with it. Nobody doing anything about it either. And then suddenly, the Spanish people did something about it. They got up and rose and tried to stop it.
Patience knew that as a nurse she was useful. She could do something. So she joined the international brigades, revolutionaries and idealists from all over the world who came together to fight against Franco's fascists. Opposing fascism was also a priority for Betty Matthews when she enrolled as a student at the London School of Economics. She was attracted to the LSE because of its reputation for intellectual radicalism. But she hadn't been there long before she was approached by John Saville, a young man who was later to become a key figure in the Communist Party.
I went to the LSE and talked with other students, and Saville was one of them. He was doing what was done then, recruiting people to the Communist Party. I remember him saying to me, as Lenin said, we must think in terms of millions. And I thought to myself, well, I don't think that means very much to me. But I'd already made up my mind that I was going to join the Communist Party. I also made up my mind I wasn't going to be his recruit. He doesn't know that to this day, but that's what happened.
She was determined to join, but on her own terms. The numbers that did join, even in the British Party's heyday in the 40s, never went beyond 60,000. But long before the founding of the party in 1920, Dora Cox, born into a left-wing family, was already studying socialism.
I'm a socialist. I was brought up a socialist. Went to socialist Sunday school. I've got my 10 Commandments. And one of our commandments was, observe and think in order to discover the truth. Never believe that which is contrary to reason, and never deceive yourself or others. And I remember one man called Mitchell who spoke to us and who told us no matter where you went in the world, you would be sure to meet a socialist. It was just stuck in my brain, him telling us that.
The comradeship of these early days was all important. To join the party was to choose a complete way of life, not just the work, school, evening classes, but the socializing too. It was a self-contained world, a parallel existence.
Oh, they had all sorts of social activities, and I watched the dancing, and men would just get up and sing a song, and women sometimes, but mostly the men. No self-consciousness about it. I fell into it.
There was a great excitement, and there was a great comradeship, camaraderie, especially amongst the young. We used to go out in rambles, together, and we cycled together, we hiked together, we had socials. It was a great feeling of togetherness about everybody that was in the party at that time.
Party life in the 20s and 30s seemed a world away from the stereotyped image of an austere, humourless rank and file. It wasn't just about speaking on street corners and selling the party newspaper, The Daily Worker. There were also lighter moments. Betty Matthews remembers what happened when the LSE's Communist Society, despite being vehemently anti-monarchy, put practicalities before principle.
I was financially dependent on this great aunt of mine who lived in Aberdeen, and she wanted me to be presented at court. There were rather important courts at that time. It was the coronation year, and I didn't want to be presented at court. It couldn't have been further from my wishes. I was boiling up about fascism and unemployment and all these things. And we decided in the party branch that it is much more important to continue with my studies than to lose the grant I was getting from her. And what was discussed was, should I drop a daily work in front of the Queen when I was presented? The branch also discussed whether I should wear my debutante's outfit in the next May Day demonstration. Didn't do it.
But she would have done had they told her to.
Oh, well, if they decided not to, I'd have gone by that decision then. Politically, we were a terribly disciplined lot. It's the kind of discipline that it's difficult to fully understand today.
The 1930s were an important time for the British Party. The effects of the Depression had been severe and had caused upheaval throughout the country. This was the time of the great hunger marches. The party mobilised the unemployed, who drew attention to their suffering by walking hundreds of miles to the capital. Dora Cox marched from Wales, a journey which took over 2 weeks.
In 1934, when from Wales about 12 women marched together with the men to London, that was the only time that women marched on a national hunger march with the men. There were 2 or 3 young girls, there were 2 or 3 older women who really found it very difficult, and then there were the middle-aged women, the wives of unemployed men, themselves unemployed, of course. And you see, we were at the head of the march, so that people saw, first of all, this group of women with red berries and rucksacks on their back at the head of this procession, you see. And it had a terrific effect on people. And I think the men were very proud of us. And there was no funny business, you know. It was very, very disciplined. It was fantastic. Yes. Discipline. And it was wonderful. It's the best time of my life.
2 years later came another chance for solidarity on the streets. In 1936, the British fascist leader Oswald Mosley and his followers tried to march on a Jewish neighbourhood in the East End of London. They were prevented from doing so by demonstrators who blocked the streets. Betty Matthews took part in what's become known as the Battle of Cable Street.
It was an amazing turnout of people. And I remember the police pressing us up against a wall somewhere. The mounted police were pressing us too, and I remember I was quite frightened. I was frightened, and yet I felt so strongly about stopping Mosley that there was this rather mixed emotion in my part, because I was physically rather frightened about it all. It made me very anti-police. Various EastEnders were throwing fireworks at the mounted police, so of course the horses were jumping up and down and getting rather panicky. And so we rather enjoyed all that part of it. You began to understand how people can influence events. To stop Mosley from his route was a terrific victory. I can't remember what we did afterwards. I suppose we probably went off somewhere and had a pint in a pub or something.
As communism took root, many of the British members rallied to the cause in the international movement Comintern. Promising young activists were sent to Moscow. Frida, once so moved by her mother's enthusiasm for the Bolsheviks, now found herself accompanying her husband to the very heart of the revolution. She started off in the typing pool, doing mundane clerical work, but her life was to change dramatically when she had a miscarriage.
I went to a hospital there and I lost a child, but I couldn't get over it for a while. And the women were saying to me, "Oh, come on, snap out of it. Our comrades are falling in Germany and here, and you're grieving over this." But that wasn't the point. I was grieving. So this Austrian sat down. He says, "You look lonely. I'll come and talk to you." It all came out, how the women were talking to me and how unhappy I was. And he said, "We've other work for you." And that's how I became a courier.
Although it sounded glamorous and exciting, life as a courier was extremely dangerous. Frida smuggled money, documents and party propaganda to beleaguered communists in Nazi Germany. Many of her contacts disappeared or were killed. It was remarkable that she survived. On one occasion she was sent to Shanghai with money for the Chinese Red Army.
I went on the Italian ship Conte Rosso, and full of Italian officers in black uniforms and boots and whatnot. I even danced with some of them. And I carried nothing but money. So even if they'd taken me, they would have thought, well, she's a money smuggler or something. But I was taking what for that time was an enormous sum, $100,000.
When she arrived in Shanghai, to her surprise, Comintern ordered her to stay there, in the flat which housed the secret radio link with Moscow. After a few months, she found out that the secret police were hunting for communists. It wouldn't be long before she'd be discovered.
I thought to myself, my God, if I disappeared, nobody would know. Nobody would go after them. Nobody would do anything. And it's a rather horrible feeling. So, anyway, I had Otto. He was my contact, a German. And then I think it was, because it was pretty cold, must have been February. Otto comes and says, "You're going, you're leaving." He said, "You're on the list." So I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "That means they'll be here, but we've got to get you out quick."
The adventures left their mark, and Patience Edney still feels haunted by the sights and sounds of the Spanish Civil War.
Yes, there's still a lot of ghosts in Spain for me. And some of the people were particularly sad. There were two chaps stood next to one another from Finland, both very badly wounded in the chest. And in those far-off days, we couldn't do anything about chest wounds. We used to just strap them out tight, which made your breathing even worse. But they were in great misery, and we couldn't speak to them. Nobody could speak Finnish, and they worried me terribly to see them. It took about 3 days to die, and we couldn't talk to them other than be loving to them.
Franco's army had German air support.
They did an awful lot of bombing us when we were on the roads, bombing refugees. But that was more like coming down, flying low, and machine gunning. You could see the people doing it. Little open planes. Mostly fair-haired Germans. We did hate them. They're smiling. It was horrible. You could see them smiling, you see, as they did this. Bastards.
It was that kind of outrage that drew a generation of idealists and intellectuals from all over the world to the side of the Republicans. Amongst them were writers like George Orwell and the American Ernest Hemingway, who later used the experiences in his books.
Hemingway was around. I was taken out a lot by Hemingway. He was interested in English girls, wanting to see what made them tick, which was very nice. I had read one of his books, the one about the hospital. I didn't much believe in it, but we were all very moved by this book. We all had it at the hospital and passed it round. So I was fascinated to meet him. And he talked like his books. He'd had a jaw injury in World War I. So he spoke rather jerkily, rather like the way he wrote, in jerks, which was interesting and nice. But of course, having been poked and prodded to see what I was like and what I felt, what my reactions were, nothing more interesting than that, is there?
I think we'd have been described as rather loose in those days.
We were naturally liberated. You don't think it all started now, do you? No. Only trouble was much worse for us then, of course, because we hadn't got any easy way of birth control, none at all. Nothing. Very tiresome. Very tiresome indeed.
Amongst the international brigades there was a contingent of American volunteers, soldiers who were supported in Spain by a team of nurses.
The American nurses had a terrible lecture before they came. That would be their duty to be convenient girlfriends for the American boys. And they're fortunate they stood up and made an immediate fuss and raged about it. It was put forward them as a duty, because they said the Spanish girls wouldn't have a duty, wouldn't be allowed. So the American girls would kindly perform, the nurses. Unfortunately, they immediately rose as one. Said, not on your Nelly, if we want to, okay, but not as a principle. Men.
Even in a party committed to equality, women were still cast in traditional roles.
We were doing all the donkey work, see? I'm a feminist now, but when I look back, there were all sorts of things I did which make me shudder when I think of them now. Taking it for granted that these men were the leaders and so on, when you could have said, well, look, I know about that, I could do that. Realizing later how accommodating one had been.
The male domination of society was reinforced by the structures and setup of the Communist Party. There was a tendency for women to be overlooked in the party. And as an individual, I've always had a tremendous problem of lack of self-confidence, which I've had to battle against. I used to find it very, very difficult to go and speak at meetings because I felt I couldn't do it. But I had to battle against that and overcome it. But I knew that I was also influenced by the general setup of things, that if there's a choice to be made, it'd be a male and not a woman.
This was even more marked in Moscow when the Communist International Workers lodged together. Frida led a protest when she discovered that not only were the men getting better food rations than the women, but they were also hogging the showers.
You had a time for the men and a time for the women. And the men would take longer because they were first. So we all stripped and walked in without anything on. The men scurried out, you'd be surprised. These days they might not have done that, but they certainly did then. Woof, We put pregnant women in front. That was funny. See, we did things like that.
Whilst the women might have rallied together for a protest in the showers, on other occasions they were not always as supportive.
I remember when I left my first husband, I was almost ostracized by women, because I'd done what maybe some of them wanted to do but didn't. And I thought, well, what's this, party women, my friends? It's not something women did. Men left women, but women didn't leave men. You don't leave God, you know.
Nor did they leave the party, even as evidence began to emerge of the true nature of Stalin's regime, the purge against the Trotskyists, the show trials, the torture camps and the executions. Many communists refused to believe it. It wasn't until 1956, when Khrushchev made a secret speech revealing the full extent of Stalin's crimes, that communists were forced to confront the truth. Frida's parents, who had moved to Russia, were well aware of the shortcomings of the revolution, but even her mother's first-hand accounts failed to convince Frida.
My mother had had enough. She got out, and she told me about some of the things that were happening there already. people they'd known who disappeared. She says, I'm even afraid for your father. But my father had not kept his American passport, so he was in a dilemma. However, I just felt that there's been some mistake. There's been a mistake. If so-and-so was taken, it's been a mistake. And there was the Soviet Union surrounded by fascist countries, and so on and so on. You went on and you justified this to yourself. When I went to visit the States in 1948, my cousin was trying to tell me, because she'd been there. And I wouldn't believe them, you see. I just didn't believe them. We supported the insupportable, but we didn't know it. We should have known it. And Khrushchev's his speech just suddenly brought it all together. And yes, it was true. And then suddenly I felt so guilty, so awful, because I hadn't believed them, and they'd been telling the truth. But I believed it then, and I wanted out. You see, it was very personal for me. It was not just the party. It was my own family. It was a personal thing my father got out by the skin of his teeth. It was not just the party that I stopped believing in.
The revelations in Khrushchev's speech shattered Frida's world. She nearly left the party. But there were many comrades who closed their minds to the truth. Betty Reed was working at party headquarters in London.
A lot of people didn't believe it. A lot of people believed it was a concoction, the Khrushchev speech. It took quite a long while.
People were saying, if only Stalin knew, he would have put a stop to it. I hate to say it. We thought he was a great, wonderful man. That's how he was regarded.
It was difficult for people to accept that they had been deceived for so long. For years, Betty Reed had been part of the machinery, faithfully peddling party propaganda. But now, she says, she'd been peddling lies.
Absolute lies. And I only the other day read the interrogation of somebody got from the archives of a man who had gone to Moscow, and on a farrago of nonsense of somebody at Reader's Digest with an article on Trotsky given him by his father, which he gave to somebody else, and a farrago of absolute nonsense, was given 5 years in the camp and lasted 3 years and died. And the last letters were, you know, we've not got underwear, I'm cold, I haven't had any letters from my wife, I don't know whether the baby has arrived, you know, this kind of thing. And that was the year I joined the party in 1937. And it's constant terror. Terrible, terrible.
The full extent of the crimes committed in the name of communism is still coming to light. It's been a gradual process, ever since the first revelations in February 1956. That early disillusion was compounded for many in November of the same year, when Soviet troops intervened to crush the Hungarian uprising. Thousands left the British Party, but most saw no alternative but to stay on, despite the deepening sense of crisis.
The first thing was the feeling of betrayal, that we'd been betrayed by the kind of corruption which had been carried out, and the atrocity stories which went on and on and on. But politically, I didn't have any feeling of leaving. A lot of people did, of course, but I felt the need to hang on and hang on to what was the party.
In a way, you were losing a part of your whole life, you know, and if there was a chance of changing our party, which we thought there might be then, at least my son and my husband did, then we ought to try to work for that rather than go. I was glad afterwards that they'd persuaded me, because we did manage some changes. But we still didn't know some of the things that were happening, and that's not right.
I didn't think then that it would break up in quite the way that it did. But, I mean, it was quite clear that we weren't recruiting, that the branches were moribund, and one really closed one's eyes to what was inevitable. I think we had to rethink, and we didn't do it soon enough.
The Communist Party of Great Britain never regained the spirit of the early years. It faded and was eventually disbanded 18 months ago. Its demise saddened Rose Kerrigan. Despite all its failures, she felt abandoned.
I'm not a quitter. I came through the period of Hungary, Czechoslovakia. To me, I always say to them, no matter what happens in these other countries, we're fighting for justice in this country. We're fighting for a better living here. And whatever they do wrong, you don't always 100% agree. But I felt that the party was the only one that could ever do anything in this country. So I said, I'm not a quitter, and neither I was through all these things. And they've quit me.
This may be a story of gradual disillusionment, but it's not one of entire regret.
Here you had a revolution which ended up in the opposite of anything any socialist would want to see. And therefore I think that the regrets I have is that history's taken the course it's taken. But I don't think it's dimmed in any way my desire to change society. I don't feel that I've wasted my life, but I'm deeply, deeply conscious that my children and my grandchildren are not going to have a very happy world to live in. But I don't know about the way forward. I don't know.
For patients, the memories of Spain are still strong.
We were modern women. We were fighting a revolutionary war. It was, yes, lovely, lovely. We lost anyhow, and we shouldn't have lost, you see. We were absolutely right in every way.
And Frida too would still have joined the party.
Oh, yes. I found myself, this little provincial girl goes to New York, to Scotland, then to London, then to Moscow, then to Shanghai. And I think what an interesting and adventurous life I've had. How would that have happened to me if I hadn't been in the party? Now, I know that's not for everybody, but it's for me.
Scarlet Women was presented by Shen Liknaitzky and produced for Omnibus by Tanya Moti.